Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Narcissism and Self-Improvement, Finding Your Inner Peanut. Tony Robbins, and these are sayings of his. Where focus goes, energy flows. The path to success is to take massive, determined action. If you do what you've always done, you'll get what you've always gotten. Knowing is not enough. You must take action. To all of those, Tony Robbins. If you wake up realizing that you haven't wet the bed and you can remember who you are, then the path to success lies just beyond your bedroom door. Me. Well, hi everybody, and this is what I'm going to use today's video as an introduction to this book. So, The Culture of Narcissism, Christopher Lasch, quite famous. Now, I like the subtitle, American Life in an Age of Diminishing Expectations, which... if you just substitute the word American for Paul's life as an age of diminishing expectations, that's my average daily mindset. Hence the epigraph I made up at the beginning. But this is quite a relatively famous book, and it was written in 1979. So what I'm going to do is go slightly back, and I'm going to introduce you to a long article that was written by a guy called Tom Wolfe, an American writer who wrote it in 1976. And this was also the time in 1977, we'll see it was when, what's his name, Tony Robbins became, when he was 17 in 1977, he started on his path to becoming a life coach, guru, whatever you want to call him. So I think it's this time from 1976 to 1979 has some interesting little kernels, if I may use that phrase, which I'll probably use again later, but little elements that are very revealing about how the way our modern culture has gone since. And this idea of a culture of narcissism. So there's lots of discussions online. My good friends Darren F. McGee and Richard Grannon do a lot on narcissism. A lot of it, though, it tends to be, completely understandably, it's helping people who've had to deal with people who are raging narcissists. So a lot of it's from quite an individual point of view. But this book, as you can see from the title, is much more about, rather than nature, the idea that you're dealing with someone who by their nature is a narcissist. It's more to do with the nurture, the culture that produces this narcissistic behavior, or at least contributes to it. And the way from memory, I think the way Christopher Lasch, and I'll go into this much more depth in future, but he tends to describe narcissism not so much on an individual basis, but in relation to the wider society. And the point of Lasch's analysis of narcissism is the idea that the individual struggles to differentiate themselves from the outside. So if you can't identify with anything outside of yourself, everything becomes about you. And it reminded me, in a previous video, I mentioned Marshall McLuhan's idea in understanding media. And he calls, I think the subtitle to that is Extensions of Man. The idea that in a media-based society, we have this weird thing where we externalize our inner nervous system. That becomes on the outside. So if you think of all the social media and people endlessly showing pictures of their private life and so on, our nervous systems are externalized. And external values, trends, influences, they become internalized. So we've almost like turned ourselves inside out. So given that he was writing in 1979, I think that's really prescient. It's really insightful, the things Lasch says, and the way in which he predicts how our society has gone in certain ways. So this is Tom Wolfe, and he's the author of the article I'm going to introduce you to. And just by way of background, in 1987 he wrote, it's funny how literature ages, because he wrote what I thought was quite a good book, The Bonfire of the Vanities, which is about the 80s ethos, about money, about the corporate world. And if you lived through the 80s, it was a strange time about money. And then he also, later on in 1998, he wrote a book that was less well received called A Man in Full, which I think they made a film out of. So they were as big, they were doorstopper big books. I think he saw himself as some types of Dickens or Balzac or Zola, trying to describe the zeitgeist of his time. I think The Bonfire of the Vanities, I remember reading them when it first came out. Very good for describing the zeitgeist. I'm not sure how well it would have aged. And then I think in non-fiction he wrote The Right Stuff, which was about the astronauts being picked for NASA. And he wrote about the drug culture from the 60s. So what I'm going to talk to you about is an essay he did in 1976 in the New York magazine, which I believe is still going. And one interesting aspect, so he wrote this article, The Me Decade. And I've put a link to it in the description box, but it's approximately something like 12,000 words, which tells its own story. Because who nowadays reads articles in a magazine of 12,000 words? And it comes in various sections. And what I'm going to do is read to you later on. For anyone from the UK, there was a children's TV program back in the day called Jack and Ori, where an actor with a much better voice than me, it would vary from actor to actor, but they'd read out a long story for kids. And as you'll shortly see, when I read out the first section of this 12,000 word mega article, it's going to be like a dark Hannibal Lecter reading a story. It's pretty gross. So if it's about bodily functions or a certain part of the anatomy. So if you're easily offended, maybe fast forward through my demented reading. And they just reminded me, so this was written in 1976. Dollar's mum in the chat section and the comments tends to really like it when I sing. But I remember I looked it up just because I thought it'd be around about this time. Charlene wrote a pop song in 1976 called I've Never Been to Me, which makes my top 10 of awful, horrendous songs, but check it out if you get the chance. So there's that all going on, and then I think, I'm looking at the date, I think it says August, yeah, my glasses aren't great, August 23rd. So we're coming up to almost exactly 50-year anniversary for this article. So that was one of the reasons for, at the time of filming, we're about a week away. So I thought it'd be interesting to look at it. And this is we're going to get to the bottom, so to speak, of the whole self-improvement industry, which is what the article, it's a very wide-ranging article, but a good couple of sections are all about what was then in its infancy, the self-help industry, the improvement industry, what nowadays is turning more into issues about self-productivity. And I'll talk about people like Chris Williamson and Steve Bartlett later. But this, I believe, is an American thing, Mr. Peanut. So if you can keep this image in your mind as I'm giving you the details of this story that Tom Wolfe wrote, this might help keep your sanity. And in case it comes up, because someone out there might be as pedantic as me, I do realise a peanut is not a nut, it's a legume. So when I talk about getting to the kernel of issues and stuff, I am appreciative that there are a whole body of people out there who get upset when you refer to a peanut as a nut. This is by complete way of a tangent. But this is, if you might recognise him if you're into music, but on the right-hand side there's a guy called Bobby Gillespie from Primal Scream, because I'm going to be talking about, in the article, Wolfe mentions various therapies, and Primal Scream Therapy was, as the name implies, just shouting out, and that's how the article begins. And there was I think it was BBC, they had a programme called, was it That Week or whatever? It was a politics programme that was on late at night, only for about half an hour, 45 minutes or something. And you can see on the left the main presenter, Andrew Neil, and then he's got a British, quite a famous politician at the time, Michael Portillo, Spanish origin, but very, very English. And I think it was Catherine Flint, you can't quite see. And at the very end of the program, this is truly bizarre, but it's just the Primal Scream link, so if you'll indulge me, I've put an actual link to the video that depicts what's going on here. And really, it's a very funny 3 minutes of your life. Basically, the story was there was I think it was called Skibidi Dance in 2018. There was a Russian band called Little Big, and they had this really bizarre, stupid, meme-like dance that became very popular. And at the end of the program, they put it on and interspersed the video with these in the studio dancing like idiots. And Bobby Gillespie just refused to join in. And he's got the face that is miserable, as only a Scottish person's face can be miserable. I think the word would be dour and dreich. But that is, yeah, a dreich face, that is. And like I say, it's only a very tangential point about the primal scream. Now, this was the guy, just to give you the context, so 1976, this article I'm going to read to you was written. 1977, I think Tony Robbins was 17, and he went to see this guy who was one of the earliest self-improvement gurus, Jim Rohn. And so you can see the phrase here, your personal philosophy is the greatest determining factor in how your life works out. Well, we'll soon find out Jim Rohn was also a pioneer of what I would call fluent tautology. And apparently the secret to earning millions of pounds for shouting at people in crowded auditoriums is to learn to speak in fluent tautologies. So this is, I had to write this down. I was watching a video and this is what he actually said in one of his talks. For things to change for you, you have to change. Otherwise, things aren't going to change. And I'm actually struggling to disagree with that in a certain weird way. But this seems to be par for the course. You say enigmatically tautological daft things and people pay good money to see you speak. So in the Culture of Narcissism, Christopher Lasch, remember this is 3 years after the Tom Wolfe article. And in this quote, the person he's quoting occasionally is Otto Kernberg, who was a psychoanalyst and psychiatrist, who I think is still alive and is 97, 98 or something. And he was famous for what was called transference-focused psychotherapy. So Christopher Lasch writes, the patients who began to present themselves for treatment in the 40s and 50s very seldom resembled the classical neuroses Freud described so thoroughly. In the last 25 years, the borderline patient who confronts the psychiatrist not with well-defined symptoms, but with diffuse dissatisfactions has become increasingly common. He does not suffer from debilitating fixations or phobias, or from the conversion of repressed sexual energy into nervous ailments. Instead, he complains of vague, diffuse dissatisfactions with life, and feels his amorphous existence to be futile and purposeless. So this notion, and I always apologize, but I always go back to Jonathan Haidt, the anxious, what's it called? The anxious generation, the role in which social media have exacerbated this notion of diffuse dissatisfactions with life. Jonathan Haidt's done brilliant work trying to quantify that as best he can. So I'll intersperse some of these quotes, as I always like to try and break up just the text, but just the scale of this is a Tony Robbins event. And I sometimes daydream, that's me, and rather than the very enthusiastic crowd you'll soon see in some of the photographs, that I would just browbeat people and shout at them through megaphones that they should read their Proust quicker and have enactments of Beckett plays on stage and everyone gets all miserable and there's zero energy in the crowd. That would be my version of this, but it's stunningly the scale of it. So again, in The Culture of Narcissism by Christopher Lasch, he describes subtly experienced yet pervasive feelings of emptiness and depression, violent oscillations of self-esteem, and a general inability to get along. Well, I've definitely got the second of those. He gains a sense of heightened self-esteem only by attaching himself to strong, admired figures whose acceptance he craves and by whom he needs to feel supported. So just to re-emphasize, 2 years before this was written, Tom Robbins has gone off to see Jim Rohn and is beginning his forays into the self-improvement industry. And this notion of strong, admired figures, they are the figures who convey to other people a sense of heightened self-esteem. And the Netflix special documentary that they did on Tony Robbins is called I'm Not Your Guru, which one can only assume is rather ironic given this Christ-like way in which he sometimes portrays himself. So there's a sense of the energy in the room. And there we are, I'm not your guru. And when I've said I will be doing work on Philip Reef, and I think I did mention this previously, but the notion of charisma, it's really interesting, one of his lesser known books. But he points out that the prophets, the biblical prophets and other major figures in history have tended to have, in religious terms, a direct line to God. There's some vertical authority. And that was the traditional notion of charisma. And interestingly, it's been transferred in the secular world to people like Tony Robbins. And I'll show you shortly, with figures like Steve Bartlett, whatever he calls himself, and Chris Williamson, I'd argue that they have a weird lack of charisma. So the new charisma is anti-charisma. So in lots of ways, we'll maybe get into, I'm not going to say too much about, what I think of Tony Robbins, because I think there's conflicting evidence. In the Netflix documentary, he shows that his whole technique and the way it's all choreographed, it seems to be in lots of ways quite manipulative, and also almost remind me of professional clairvoyance when they do crowd work. So there's that element. But then apparently there was a Stanford University study, a clinical trial of one of his training programs that found it to be highly efficacious. So I'm going to be broadly agnostic. But whatever you say about Tony Robbins, whether you like him or not, he's just immensely charismatic. Whereas I find it more bizarre the later influencers who seem to have no charisma at all. So I don't mean to be mean, but I just don't get the whole Chris Williamson, and it's modern wisdom. The lack of wisdom in a genuine traditional sense. He's right. Modern wisdom seems to describe what he offers, and therein lies the problem, if you ask me. And this was when I watched this, where Tony Robbins was actually on Chris Williamson's podcast. And it was interesting because, again, I repeat, there is an element of, I'm trying to think of a polite word, but you've seen from some of the quotes I've given you as motivational phrases. It's tautologous, it's sometimes vacuous, vapid, whatever word with a V you want to use. But when he's conversing with Chris Williamson, I actually think Tony Robbins comes across as verbally very articulate, very intelligent. Chris Williamson, not so much. So again, I just repeat, he's charismatic, Tony Robbins, and it strikes me as highly intelligent. And you can then argue, does he put that intelligence to good use? He's obviously earned a fortune, but also in the documentary comes across as highly empathetic and genuinely trying to help people. So there's lots of pluses and minuses that if you're trying to assess your response to Tony Robbins. But with characters like Steve Bartlett, I don't get the same sense of anything. And recently he went semi-viral because he described how he had 2 glasses of wine and he lost 3 days of his life because I think he talked about the domino effect. It affected his circadian rhythms and his sleep patterns, and Uranus wasn't aligned with Venus, and he had an attack of the vapors, and it was all like a scene from a Jane Austen novel. But for a man of his size and age and fitness to say they'd lost 3 days of their life, because of 2 glasses of wine. It would be interesting if any older viewers have got younger kids or family members. I was thinking about this, and what I thought was shocking about Stephen Bartlett's narcissistic, self-obsessive, worrying about 2 glasses of wine. I get the strong sense that if you presented that to a 20-year-old today, they would think, yeah, well, I can see his point. And maybe you have to be older to be completely nonplussed by the big girl's blouseness of it all, if I can use that technical phrase. And then back to Chris Williamson. So it's a whole, bro thing. I never got forearms like that with my athletic career as a semi-professional darts player. But he is ripped. He is, it's all about self-productivity, making the most of yourself, even when you then become incredibly ill and you try and monetize, without being too cynical, but he filmed his illness, and then he's so tightly wound and he never takes a break, and he has to even film when he's in poor health. I think he claimed he was diagnosed, and this is another huge issue, Lyme disease, mold poisoning, and he had a whole range of symptoms that struck me that his best chance of recovery, he went off to Mexico. I think this was when he went to Mexico for blood transfusions. And I think I've said in a previous video quite a while ago, how about just take a month off and go to a tropical island with all your money and relax and not be online and not push yourself to the nth degree and just get over yourself and, float around on a lilo, paddling and have fun. But this doesn't seem, even ill health is just part of this treadmill of social media content. So back to Christopher Lasch. The struggle to maintain psychic equilibrium in a society that demands submission to the rules of social intercourse, but refuses to ground those rules in a code of moral conduct, encourages a form of self-absorption that has little in common with the primary narcissism of the imperial self. So archaic elements increasingly dominate personality structure, and the self shrinks back toward a passive and primeval state in which the world remains uncreated, unformed. I'm thinking with the imperial self, he's referring to, for example, say the British Empire. You'd have these kepi, helmet-wearing, khaki uniformed British officers stomping around the world, imposing their will in quite a narcissistic way. But it did make me think when I read this of when you see the Tony Robbins huge public events. And I just think it is, I was going to say it's uniquely American or North American, but it isn't, because people from all over the world come into these evangelical events. But there is something, there's the old imperial Brit in me that just thinks I'd rather eat my own arm than show that level of emotional incontinence in public. It's just, there is a North American, British, or there used to be, and this is one of the things, I think Britain's becoming more like the 51st state, so we're adopting many more American traits. But just give you one little daft example, the Beard Meats Food, if you ever watch it, it's like he's a professional eater on YouTube, and whenever he's in the UK, there's zero enthusiasm for his eating challenges. But when he's in the US, everyone's like, whoop, whoop, go on, you can do it. Yeah, go on, Adam, go on. And you just don't get that. Or in the UK still, thankfully. I just like to, celebrate difference and the misery and the lack of enthusiasm of good old-fashioned British people. But anyway, I'm digressing. But this idea of the self shrinks back toward a passive and primeval state in which the world remains uncreated, unformed. The egomaniacal, experience-devouring imperial self, the kepi helmet-wearing British officer, so to speak, regresses into a grandiose, narcissistic, infantile, empty self. And this is relevant for what's coming up. A dark, wet hole where everything finds its way sooner or later. I remain near the entrance, handling goods as they're shoved in, listening and nodding. I have been slowly dissolving into this cavity. So this is the sense of the modern narcissist the person who, because of largely their cultural environment, is struggling to achieve a sense of independent identity, and you become this narcissistic, infantile, empty self, a dark, wet hole. So, like I say, you've been warned. I thought we'd have the nice life-affirming picture here from Edvard Munch, the scream, and you'll see the relevance. I'll read you the first section. It'll take a while, so hopefully you'll find it entertaining or interesting. So this is the first section of the Tom Wolfe, the Me Decade article, and the first section's entitled Me and My Hemorrhoids. So I don't think Charlene did a song called that. The trainer said, "Take your finger off the repress button." Everybody was supposed to let go, let all the vile stuff come up and gush out. They even provided vomit bags like the ones on a 747, in case you literally let it gush out. Then the trainer told everybody to think of the one thing you would most like to eliminate from your life. And so, what does our girl blurt out over the microphone? Hemorrhoids! Just so. That was how she ended up in her present state, stretched out on the wall-to-wall carpet of the banquet hall of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, with her eyes closed and her face pressed into the stubble of the carpet, which is a thick commercial weave and feels like clothes brush bristles against her face and smells a bit high from cleaning solvent. That was how she ended up lying there, concentrating on her hemorrhoids. Eyes shut, deep in her own space. Her hemorrhoids. The grisly peanut. See, the thumbnail's making sense now. Finally. Many others are stretched out on the carpet all around her. Some 249 other souls, in fact. They're all strewn across the floor of the banquet hall with their eyes closed just as she is. But Christ, the others are concentrating on things that sound serious and deep when you talk about them, and how they had talked about them. They had all marched right up to the microphone and shared, as the trainer called it. What did they want to eliminate from their lives? Why, they took their fingers right off the old repress button and told the whole room. My husband, my wife, my homosexuality, my inability to communicate, my self-hatred, self-destructiveness, craven fears, puling weaknesses, primordial horrors, premature ejaculation, impotence, frigidity, rigidity, subservience, laziness, alcoholism, major vices, minor vices, grim habits, twisted psyches, tortured souls. I think I have about 80% of those. And then it had been her turn, and she had said, hemorrhoids. You can imagine what this sounded like, what that sounded like. That broke the place up. The trainer looked like a cocky little bastard up there on the podium with his deep tan, white tennis shirt, and peach-coloured sweater. A dynamite colour combination, all very casual and spontaneous. After about 2 hours of trying on different outfits in front of a mirror, that kind of casual and spontaneous, if her guess was right. And yet she found him attractive. Commanding was the word. He probably wondered if she was playing the wiseacre with her hemorrhoids, but he rolled with it. Maybe she was being playful. Just looking at him made her feel mischievous. In any event, hemorrhoids was what had bubbled up into her brain. Then the trainer had told them to stack their folding chairs in the back of the banquet hall and lie down on the floor and close their eyes and get deep into their own spaces and concentrate on that one item they wanted to get rid of the most and really feel it and let the feeling gush out. So now she's lying here, concentrating on her hemorrhoids. The strange thing is, it's no joke after all. She begins to feel her hemorrhoids in all their morbid presence. She can actually feel them. The sieges always began with her having the sensation that her peanut was caught in her anal sphincter. That meant a section of swollen varicose vein had pushed its way out of her intestines and was actually coming out of her bottom. It was as hard as a peanut and felt a bit big. Felt bigger and grislier than a peanut. A pumped up peanut. A Tony Robbins sized peanut. That's on me adding, by the way. Well, for God's sake, in her daily life, even at work, especially at work, and she works for a movie distributor, her whole picture of herself was of her seductive physical presence. She was not the most successful businesswoman in Los Angeles, but she was certainly successful enough, and quite in addition to that, she was the main sexual presence in the office. When she walked into the office each morning, everyone, women as well as men, checked her out. She knew that. She could feel her sexual presence go through the place like an invisible chemical, like a hormone, a scent, a universal solvent. The most beautiful moments came when she would be in her office or a conference room or at Mr. Chow's taking a meeting. Nobody had meetings anymore. They took them. With 2 or 3 men she had never met before or barely knew. The overt subject was inevitably, eternally, the deal. She always said there should be only one credit line up on the screen for any movie. Deal buy. But the meeting would also have a subplot. The overt plot would be the deal. The subplot would be the men get turned on by me. Pretty soon, even though the conversation had not strayed overtly from the deal, the men would be swaying in unison like June grass at the beach, and she was the wind, of course. And then one of the men would say something and smile, and at the same time reach over and touch her, on top of the hand or on the side of the arm, as if it meant nothing, as if it were just a gesture for emphasis. But in fact, a man is usually deathly afraid of reaching out and touching a woman he doesn't know, and she knew it meant she had hypnotized him sexually. Well, for God's sake, at just that sublime moment, likely as not, the goddamn peanut would be popping out of her tail. As she smiled sublimely at her conquest, she also had to sit in her chair lopsided, with one cheek of her buttocks higher than the other, as if she were about to crepitate, because it hurt to sit squarely on the peanut. If for any reason she had to stand up at that point and walk, she would have to walk as if her hip joints were rusted out, as if she was 65 years old, because a normal stride pressed the peanut, and the pain would start up, and the bleeding too, very likely. Or if she couldn't get up and had to sit there for a while and keep her smile, and her hot hormonal squinted eyes pinned on the men before her, the peanut would start itching or burning, and she would start double-tracking as if her mind were a tape deck, with 2 channels going at once. In one, she's the sexual princess, the Circe, taking a meeting and clouding men's minds. And in the other, she's a poor bitch who wants nothing more in this world than to go down the corridor to the ladies' room and get some Kleenex and some Vaseline and push the peanut back up into her intestines with her finger. And even if she's able to get away and do that, she will spend the rest of the day and the next, with a deep worry in the back of her brain. The sort of worry that always stays on the edge of your consciousness, no matter how hard you think of something else. She will be wondering at all times what the next bowel movement will be, how solid and compact the bolus will be, trying to think back and remember if she's had any milk, cream, chocolate, or any other binding substance in the last 24 hours, or any nuts or fibrous vegetables like broccoli. Is she really in for it this time? The sexual princess. On the outside, she has her fireproof grin and her Fiorio scarf, as if to say she lives in a world of Sevilles and 450 SLs and dinner last night at Dominic's, a movie business restaurant on Beverly Boulevard that's so exclusive, Dominic keeps his neon sign, Dominic's, turned off to make the wimps think it's closed. But she, hi Dominic, can get a table, but inside... it's all the battle between the bolus and the peanuts. And is it too late to leave the office and go and get some mineral oil and let some of that vile glop roll down her gullet, or get a refill on the softener tablets, or eat some prunes, or drink some coffee, or do something else to avoid one of those horrible hard clay boluses that keep come grinding out of her, crushing the peanut and starting not only the bleeding, but the pain, a horrible, humiliating pain that feels like she's getting a paper cut in her anus, like the pain you feel when the edge of a piece of bond paper slices your finger, plus a horrible, hellish, purple, bloody, varicose pressure, but lasting not for an instant, like a paper cut, but for an eternity, prolonged until the tears are rolling down her face as she sorry, Freudian slip. As she sits, I said, in the cubicle, and she wants to cry out, to scream until it's over. I thought I could avoid this, sorry. To make the screams of fear, fury, and humiliation obliterate the pain. But someone would hear. There's tears coming out of my eyes. And I don't have any issues like this poor woman. You'll be very glad to hear. But someone would hear. No doubt they'd come bursting right into the ladies' room to save her and feed their morbid curiosities. And what could she possibly say? And so she had simply held that feeling in all these years, with her eyes on fire, and her entire pelvic saddle a great purple tub of pain. She had repressed the whole squalid horror of it, the searing peanut. Until now, the trainer had said, take your finger off the repress button, let it gush up and pour out. And now, as she lies here on the floor of the banquet hall of the Ambassador Hotel with 249 other souls, she knows exactly what he meant. She can feel it all of the pain, and on top of the pain, all the humiliation. And for the first time in her life, she has permission from the management, from herself, and from everyone around her to feel the gushing forth. So she starts moaning. And apologies, but this is what's written. Oh! And when she starts moaning, the most incredible and exhilarating thing begins to happen. A wave of moans spreads through the people lying around her, as if her energy were radiating out like a radar pulse. Oh! So she lets her moan rise into a keening sound. And when she begins to keen, the souls near her begin keening, even when the moans are still spreading to the prostrate folks further from her, or maybe the prostate folks further from her on the edges of the room. So she lets her keening sound rise up into a real scream. I'll keep trying to get the volume down. And this rolls out in a wave too, first through those near her and then toward the far edges. Oh. And it just goes on. Right. So it seems like all the vowels that are lacking in the Welsh language are in this essay. And so it turns out, and so she turns it all the way up into a scream, such as she has never allowed herself in her entire life. And her full scream spreads from soul to soul, over top of the keens and fading moans. Until at last the entire room is consumed in her scream, as if there are no longer 250 separate souls, but one new sphere of souls united in some incorporeal way by her scream. Oh, we got there. So then it finishes with this quote, which is not simply her scream any longer, but the world's. Each soul is concentrated on its own burning item. My husband, my wife, my homosexuality, my inability to communicate, my self-hatred, self-destruction, craven fears, puling weaknesses, primordial horrors, premature ejaculation, impotence, rigidity, subservience, laziness, alcoholism, major vices, minor vices, grim habits, twisted psyches, tortured souls. And yet, each unique item has been raised to a cosmic level and united with every other until there is but one piercing moment of release and liberation at last, a whole world of anguish set free by my hemorrhoids. Me and my hemorrhoids star at the Ambassador during a 3-day Erhard Seminars training EST course in the hotel banquet hall. The truly odd part, however, is yet to come. In her experience lies the explanation of certain grand puzzles of the 1970s, a period that will come to be known as the me decade. Exhausted now. So that's the crescendo, and it's the way in which Tom Wolfe uses the biological peanut as a way of, it's an extended metaphor, literally and metaphorically, so to speak, of the way in which you focus on your inner self so much that it reaches these ludicrous levels. And then he extends it out to talk about the nature of the society that's produced these problems. And he talks about the way in which America from the 40s and 50s onwards, post-war, it was one of the biggest growths in personal wealth in history, focused on the American people. So it was remarkably enough that ordinary folks now had enough money to take it and run off and alter the circumstances of their lives and create new roles for themselves, such as trailer sailor or gerontoid cowboy. But simultaneously, still others decided to go all the way. They plunged straight toward what has become the alchemical dream of the me decade. The old alchemical dream was changing base metals into gold. The new alchemical dream is changing one's personality, remaking, remodeling, elevating, and polishing one's very self, and observing, studying, and doting on it, me. This had always been an aristocratic luxury confined throughout most of history to the life of the courts, since only the very wealthiest classes had the free time and the surplus income to dwell upon this sweetest and vainest of pastimes. It smacks so much of vanity, in fact, that the noble folk involved in it always took care to call it quite something else. So I think the way that he talks about it, Wolfe, is that the children of the richest people, for example, might be sent to what were called finishing schools. And in a way, that was like being sent on an intensive educational therapy course. So it's all, this type of thing's always been around, Wolfe's saying, but it's only when you're suffering from affluenza, so to speak, do you tend to get this search for the therapeutic cure to this extent. And it's, you can see, like Tony Robbins, bit of a difference. The evangelical nature of these huge, the scale of it. That's going to be like the first Readers of the Lost Art get together in Texas, I've decided. So outsiders hearing of these, he's talking about encounter sessions now, so like Primal Scream Therapy, wondered what on earth their appeal was, yet the appeal was simple enough. It is summed up in the notion, let's talk about me. No matter whether you manage to renovate your personality through encounter sessions or not, you had finally focused your attention and your energies on the most fascinating subject on earth, me. Not only that, you also put me up on stage before a live audience. The popular est movement has managed to do that with great refinement. Just imagine me and my hemorrhoids moving an entire hall to the most profound outpouring of emotion. Just imagine my life becoming a drama with universal significance, analysed like Hamlet's for what it signifies for the rest of mankind. And one element of this, I mentioned maybe the British, at least it used to be, stiff upper lip, more emotional, repression. You know, you keep everything pressed down in a little box inside and you never let it out. And that's what got us an empire. But there is this within the UK as well. So a while ago, I don't think it runs anymore, but on television, excuse me, there was a TV program called Embarrassing Bodies. And basically it was, as the name implied, something's wrong with your body and you need to go and see a doctor. So guess what the most natural thing on earth is? You go to the TV doctor with every camera angle imaginable, rammed up various orifices to show the whole world what your incredibly embarrassing problem is. And this was primetime TV, and I've just never understood who on earth... The only explanation is what Wolfe's describing here. People are prepared to have their most intimate parts filmed on national television because no matter how embarrassing, at least it's their story being told. And then you've got the whole selfie generation doing a training course on the self. So it's all coming together. In 1961, a copywriter named Shirley Polikoff was working for the Foot, Cone and Belding advertising agency on the Clairol hair dye account when she came up with the line, "If I've only one life, let me live it as a blonde." In a single slogan, she had summed up what might be described as the secular side of the me decade. If I've only one life, let me live it as a... You only have to fill in the blank. And I really like this picture because you have the crazed evangelical person receiving the spirit, the Pentecostal spirit of Tony Robbins. You've got the woman on the right who's really concentrating. You've got the man in the blue behind her who's, I think he's fallen asleep. And then you've got the guy in the orange he's just having a whinge. So there's a lot of emotions on show. And the third Great Awakening, he divides in, it's not important, but Wolfe divides various sections, awakenings in American religious history, and that's what the article refers to. And he's saying in the 70s they were living through the third Great Awakening. Whatever the third Great Awakening amounts to, for better or for worse, will have to do with this unprecedented post-World War II American development. The luxury enjoyed by so many millions of middling folk of dwelling upon the self. At first glance, Shirley Polikoff's slogan, "If I've only one life, let me live it as a blonde," seems like merely another example of a superficial and irritating rhetorical trope, antanaclasis, that now happens to be fashionable among advertising copywriters. But in fact, the notion of "if I've only one life" challenges one of those assumptions of society that are so deep-rooted and ancient, they have no name. They are simply lived by. In this case, man's age-old belief in serial immortality. So, antanaclasis, this rhetorical trope, it's, as is pointed out in the slogan, it's when it's used in advertising a lot, but in classical literature, it refers to a figure of speech or a type of pun, where you've got a single word or a phrase is repeated in the second part of a sentence, but in the second part its meaning changes. So you use it, you emphasize it differently, and it creates irony, humor. So you can see how they use it in this particular Clairol advert. But this thing I've emboldened, the way in which I hesitate to bring in old Christopher Nolan again, but I think it's one of the aspects of the film where he almost denies history. Homer's writing about, especially in the Iliad, but in the Odyssey, about getting home, about roots, about the generations of valor, all these things. But in the ancient literature, it was this idea of the age-old belief in serial immortality. In other words, yes, a generation dies, but their reputation and their honor is carried on into the next. Whereas now, Wolfe is arguing it becomes much more about me, me, me. And someone is having an epiphanic recognition of their meanness here. The husband and wife who sacrifice their own ambitions and their material assets in order to provide a better future for their children. The soldier who risks his life, or perhaps consciously sacrifices it, in battle. The man who devotes his life to some struggle for his people that cannot possibly be won in his lifetime. People, or most of them, who buy life insurance or leave wills, and, for that matter, most women upon becoming pregnant for the first time, are people who conceive of themselves, however unconsciously, as part of a great biological stream. Just as something of their ancestors lives on in them, so will something of them live on in their children, or in their people, their race, their community. For childless people too, conduct their lives and try to arrange their post-mortem affairs with concern for how the great stream is going to flow on. And again, what Wolfe's arguing is that's changed in contemporary times. The great stream of life. So Christopher Nolan tries to make the Odyssey as contemporary as possible. He downplays the links to the past and the continuity with past tradition and past mythical legacy and everything he tries to bring up to the present day. And in these evangelical type self-improvement meetings, there's no... I'm just to repeat, I think Tony Robbins is actually quite a bright guy, but there's no reference to anything that would take you out of the present. There's no reference to literature of the past. There's no reference to great thinkers of the past. It's Tony and you in the hall with helpers in the audience trying to get everyone excited, strategical use of music, psychological ploys, interventions, all of this stuff to create this frenzy of being in the now. Most people historically have not lived their lives as if thinking, I have only one life to live. Instead, they have lived as if they are living their ancestors' lives and their offspring's lives and perhaps their neighbours' lives as well. They have seen themselves as inseparable from the great tide of chromosomes of which they are created and which they pass on. The mere fact that you were only going to be here a short time and would be dead soon enough did not give you the license to try and climb out of the stream and change the natural order of things. The Chinese in ancestor worship have literally worshipped the great tide itself and not any god or gods. For anyone to renounce the notion of serial immortality in the West or the East has been to defy what seems like a law of nature. Excuse me. Hence the wicked feeling, the excitement of, if I've only one life, let me live it as a fill in the blank if you dare. And now many dare it. In Democracy in America, Tocqueville, the inevitable and ubiquitous Tocqueville, saw the American sense of equality itself as disrupting the stream, which he called time's pattern, which reminds me of the Proust live stream that Stuart and I do. Not only does democracy make each man forget his ancestors, it hides his descendants from him and divides him from his contemporaries. It continually turns him back into himself and threatens at last to enclose him entirely in the solitude of his own heart. A grim prospect to the good Alexis de T. But what did he know about let's talk about me? Yes, very exciting. Tocqueville's idea of modern man lost in the solitude of his own heart has been brought forward into our time in such terminology as alienation, Marx, anomie, Durkheim, the mass man, Ortega y Gasset, and the lonely crowd, Riesman. The picture is always of a creature uprooted by industrialism, packed together in cities with people he doesn't know, helpless against massive economic and political shifts. In short, a creature like Charlie Chaplin in modern times, a helpless, bewildered, and dispirited slave to the machinery. This victim of modern times has always been a most appealing figure to intellectuals, artists, and architects. The poor devil so obviously needs us to be his engineers of the soul, to use a term popular in the Soviet Union in the 1920s. We will Pygmalionize this sad lump of clay into a homo novus, a new man with a new philosophy, a new aesthetics, not to mention new Bauhaus housing and furniture. And this is a scene from Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times when he's on the assembly line, experiencing being dehumanized. And you've got the machinery, which in our time has been overtaken by digital doodahs left, right, and centre. I think doodah is a technical term. And we've morphed into, from the Charlie Chaplin, I said, the digital doodahs, the constant self-reflection. So here you have Caravaggio's Narcissus painting reimagined for our times. So he finishes at least, this is towards the very end of the article. But once the dreary little bastards started getting money in the 1940s, they did an astonishing thing. They took their money and ran. They did something only aristocrats and intellectuals and artists were supposed to do. They discovered and started doting on me. They've created the greatest age of individualism in American history. All rules are broken. The prophets are out of business. Where the third great awakening will lead, who can presume to say? Only one only knows that the great religious waves have a momentum all their own. Neither arguments nor policies nor acts of the legislature have been any match for them in the past, and this one has the mightiest, holiest roll of all, the beat that goes, me, 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 me. But luckily, we have I'm Not Your Guru, Tony Robbins, to help us. So I hope that was vaguely interesting. Like I say, it was designed to give you an introduction for a fuller, deeper dive into Christopher Lasch's much more sociological and Freud-informed discussion of what narcissism on a cultural level is like. But I thought it would be interesting to look at Tom Wolfe's much more, what would be the word, not haphazard, but just a little more laid back, just a journalistic description of what was going on in America 3 years before Christopher Lasch published his book. And as you can see from the way he wrote, I think he nailed on a lot of processes and social tendencies that we're still dealing with today. So I hope you found that useful, and until the next time, all the very best. Take care.